I thought I was just visiting my friend, until his mom came home crying and whispered, "Just hold me, don't let go yet." I had expected the usual bustle of my friend's house, the clatter of dishes, the faint aroma of his mom's cooking, the sound of laughter or the TV humming in the background. Instead, the moment I stepped through the front door, there was a strange quiet. The air felt heavier than usual, and I noticed it immediately. It wasn't an oppressive silence, but more like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, though I didn't see her at first. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds. Then, a small movement caught my eye, her hand brushing against the edge of the counter as she leaned slightly forward, eyes distant. There was a grace to her posture, even in that moment of quiet. She was always physically elegant, but tonight, it seemed tinged with something else, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I noticed little things right away. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the faint crease forming between her brows, the careful, almost hesitant way she moved across the kitchen floor. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone used to managing everything in her life, but her shoulders slumped just slightly, betraying fatigue or worry. And yet, even with that subtle weariness, there was something magnetic about her presence, a quiet authority wrapped in warmth. I took a step further into the room, hoping not to intrude, and I could smell it, her perfume, light and comforting, mingling with the lingering aroma of fresh bread from the morning. It was subtle but unmistakably hers, a scent that always seemed to anchor the house in some unspoken sense of home. And tonight, for some reason, it felt different, softer, almost melancholy. When she finally noticed me, she gave a small, polite smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was enough to make me wonder what she was feeling, what had happened earlier that day. I wanted to ask, but I could feel the unspoken rule, observe, don't intrude. So, I stayed silent, letting my gaze take in the little details, the warmth of the afternoon sunlight spilling across the wooden floorboards, the gentle sway of the curtains in the light breeze from the open window, the soft sound of her voice as she muttered something to herself while reaching for a cup. I realized then how much I had underestimated her presence. She wasn't just my friend's mom. She was a woman who carried a lifetime of experience in her gestures, in the quiet steadiness of her movements, in the way her hands rested lightly on the counter as if grounding herself. Even without words, she had a way of filling the space around her, not with noise, but with a calm, compelling energy that drew attention without demanding it. And for the first time, I noticed the subtle tension in the room, a quiet ripple that suggested something had changed, something that even she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. It made my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. I didn't know what was coming, but I sensed, instinctively, that tonight would be different. Something unspoken was about to unfold, and I was standing at the edge of it, observing, waiting, and unable to look away. I had been sitting on the edge of the couch, absently scrolling through my phone, when I heard the front door click. At first, I thought it was my friend returning, but the timing felt off. The sound carried differently through the quiet house, heavier, weighted with something unspoken. My heart instinctively lifted, and I looked toward the entrance just as she appeared. She looked different. Something about her presence immediately caught my attention. Her posture was slightly stooped, the confident grace she usually carried softened by a visible tension. Her steps were deliberate but slow, as if each one took conscious effort. The familiar warmth I always associated with her was still there, but now it was shadowed by an unmistakable vulnerability. Her eyes, when they met mine, were glossy, not from anger or frustration, but from something rawer, sorrow. She didn't speak at first, just paused in the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame for support. Her hand lingered on the door handle, fingers gripping it with quiet insistence, and I noticed a small quiver in her shoulders. I wanted to speak, to ask if she was okay, but something told me to wait. She needed to arrive fully, to let herself feel whatever had brought her here. The air smelled faintly of rain from outside, mixed with the lingering aroma of her perfume, soft and comforting, almost like a tether to the world she usually controlled so effortlessly. Even now, I could tell she had tried to compose herself, smoothing her blouse and adjusting her hair before stepping inside, but the tension had seeped into the edges, the way her lips pressed together, the faint tremor in her jaw, the subtle tightening of her hands against the doorway. She finally moved forward, hesitating a moment at the threshold as if testing whether the room would absorb her grief or reject it. I noticed a soft intake of breath, almost like she was bracing herself. And then she spoke, barely above a whisper, her voice trembling slightly, carrying more emotion than I had ever heard from her before. I just need someone to be here. Her words struck me in a way I hadn't expected. I could feel the gravity of them, the unspoken plea woven between each syllable. Without thinking, I stood, moving closer, careful not to crowd her, careful to give her the space she both needed and, somehow, craved. Even as I approached, I noticed the small details that made her human in that fragile moment, the way her fingers flexed nervously at her sides, the quiet catch in her breathing, the subtle shiver that ran through her despite the warm afternoon air. For a moment, she didn't speak again. She just let herself lean into the room, letting the door close behind her with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. And then, just as quietly, she allowed herself to exhale, a shaky, almost imperceptible sigh that carried the weight of whatever had been building all day. I stayed still, a few steps away, watching, waiting, unsure if I should reach out or simply remain present. In that silence, the house felt different, heavier, but charged with something fragile and intimate. It was as if the walls themselves had shifted, making room for a vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. And I realized, almost against my own awareness, that this was the moment everything could change. The simple act of being there, just present, felt more important than anything else I could do. I didn't know what had happened yet. I didn't know how far I would be drawn into the unfolding emotion. But one thing was clear, the quiet of the house had shifted, and with it, so had the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Tonight, nothing would stay the same. The moment she spoke, it felt like the room itself shifted. Just hold me, she whispered, her voice so soft that I had to lean in slightly to catch it. Don't let go yet. I froze for a heartbeat, caught between instinct and hesitation. I knew she needed comfort, but I also knew the fragility of this moment demanded care, a balance of presence without intrusion. She didn't step closer immediately, instead, she lingered, allowing herself to be vulnerable while still maintaining a quiet dignity. Her arms rested lightly at her sides, but there was a subtle tremor in her fingers, betraying the tension she was holding inside. The air between us seemed charged with anticipation, not of anything overtly romantic, but of something deeply human, a yearning for closeness, for reassurance. I moved slowly toward her, careful to match her pace, careful not to startle her. The soft carpet muffled my steps, but even the quietest movement seemed amplified in the hushed room. When I reached her, I offered my arms, a silent question in my gaze. Her eyes met mine, glistening, and for a moment, she simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, allowing me to guide the embrace without breaking the fragile trust she had placed in me. When she leaned in, the warmth of her body pressed gently against mine, and I became acutely aware of her weight, the soft rise and fall of her breathing. Her cheek brushed lightly against my chest, and the faint scent of her perfume enveloped me, grounding the moment in a strange, comforting intimacy. I felt her hands rest briefly on my back, tentative at first, then with a bit more certainty as she seemed to draw strength from my presence. I could hear her quiet, uneven breaths, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The soft creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even the ticking of the clock, all of it faded into insignificance. What mattered was the warmth between us, the subtle pressure of her body seeking grounding, and the steady steadiness of mine offering it. As I held her, I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, quickened not by attraction in the obvious sense, but by the intimacy of this unspoken connection. The way her fingers flexed slightly against my back, the faint shiver that ran through her shoulders, even the way her hair brushed against my arm, every detail etched itself into my awareness. I realized then that closeness could exist without words, that sometimes a shared silence, a measured presence, could communicate more than anything spoken. She pulled back just slightly, resting her forehead against my chest, and let out a soft sigh. It wasn't a sigh of relief yet, not entirely, but it was the first acknowledgement of letting herself lean on someone else, fully, without pretense. I tightened my arms subtly, careful to convey stability without pressure, my own emotions quietly swelling with empathy and the weight of trust she had placed in me. In that embrace, the boundaries of our usual dynamic, mother, friend, visitor, blurred just enough to allow for a moment of pure human connection. There was no rush, no expectation, only the gentle, unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes holding someone close, simply being there, could be the most profound act of care imaginable. And in that quiet, slow-burn intimacy, I sensed the beginning of something that would linger far beyond this single, fragile evening. For a long moment, we remained in that quiet embrace, the only sounds the steady rhythm of her breath and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I could feel her leaning into me slightly, not for physical comfort alone, but for emotional grounding. It was as if the weight of her day, the burdens she had carried silently, had finally found a place to rest. And I realized that she wasn't just asking to be held, she was asking to be truly seen, to be acknowledged in her most unguarded state. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper, but every word carried the weight of someone who had been holding back for far too long. She told me, in fragments and pauses, about the stress that had built over weeks, the loneliness she sometimes felt when the house was quiet, and the subtle ache of trying to hold everything together for others while forgetting herself. Her voice trembled at times, and I could feel the quiet desperation behind each pause, each intake of breath. I didn't interrupt. I didn't try to offer advice or solutions. I just held her, my arms providing a steady presence, letting her know without words that she was not alone. Her cheek pressed lightly against my chest, and I became acutely aware of the rise and fall of her breathing, the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way her hands rested tentatively on my back, seeking reassurance without demanding it. She paused again, and I felt her small sigh, one of exhaustion and relief mixed together. The kind of sigh that comes after carrying an invisible weight for far too long and finally letting it touch another person. I could feel her fingers pressing gently into the fabric of my shirt, almost unconsciously, as if anchoring herself to the moment. I noticed how fragile she seemed and yet how resilient, the delicate balance of vulnerability and strength radiating from her in quiet waves. In that moment, I realized how rare it was to witness someone reveal themselves so fully, without armor, without pretense. There was no performance, no expectation, just a human being, asking for connection, and another human being, quietly offering it. I felt a strange mix of admiration, protectiveness, and an emotional pull I couldn't fully define. It wasn't desire in the conventional sense, not yet, it was deeper, subtler, an awareness of how profoundly trust and vulnerability could draw people together. Her voice came again, softer this time, a mere murmur against the steady beat of my chest. I didn't know if I could let myself feel this. And in that confession, I understood her completely. It wasn't just grief or stress, it was the silent longing to be allowed to rest, to be held, to have someone see the parts of herself that she usually kept carefully tucked away. I tightened my embrace slightly, careful to communicate empathy and reassurance without overstepping. She leaned further into me, a quiet sigh escaping her lips, and for the first time in hours, maybe days, I felt the tension in her body soften. The warmth of her presence, the subtle shifts of her hands and the rise and fall of her breathing, created a shared rhythm between us. In that quiet, suspended moment, it became clear, this connection was more than comfort. It was a slow, unspoken bond forming through trust, through presence, through the simple act of letting someone feel seen. And in that realization, I knew that whatever came next, the space we were creating, fragile, intimate, human, would linger far beyond the walls of this room. We stayed in the quiet of the living room, the soft golden light from the afternoon sun spilling across the floor and pooling around her feet. The air seemed heavier now, but not with tension, with something warmer, more intimate. I could feel her body leaning slightly into mine, not fully, but enough to sense the comfort she was drawing from my presence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly human, a silent acknowledgement that she could trust me in this moment. Her hands rested lightly on my shoulders at first, tentative and searching, and then, slowly, they moved to my back, fingertips brushing in tiny, careful circles. I noticed the shift, the way her breathing steadied, how her fingers lingered longer than necessary, not in any deliberate attempt at closeness, but because she needed the quiet reassurance that someone was there for her. There was a fragility in her posture that invited care, and I responded naturally, arms tightening just enough to provide that grounding without pressing too hard. She lifted her head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and for a brief instant, everything else faded. The room, the muted ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, none of it mattered. Her gaze held a mixture of gratitude and something more delicate, something unspoken, like a bridge forming between our hearts. There was a quiet tension in that look, a subtle pull, but it was gentle, safe, and entirely grounded in human connection. Her voice broke the silence, soft and almost shy. I don't know what I'd have done if you weren't here. There was no melodrama, no pleading, just honesty. Her words settled into the space between us, and I felt a quiet swell of protectiveness. I whispered back, softly, "You don't have to do anything alone. I'm here." The simplicity of it seemed enough, and she responded with a small, relieved smile, one that reached her eyes this time, hinting at the trust and comfort building quietly between us. Even as the emotional intimacy deepened, the subtle rhythm of our small gestures carried a powerful weight. I noticed the faint brush of her hair against my chest when she leaned in, the soft press of her palms against my back, the warmth of her cheek resting lightly near mine. It was a slow, unspoken dance, one that needed no words, only presence. I felt the warmth of her body, steady and real, and realized that emotional closeness could be just as tangible as physical proximity. She sighed softly again, a mixture of exhaustion and relief, and I could feel the tension leaving her shoulders. In that exhale, I recognized something profound, the human need for connection, for care, for someone to simply witness your vulnerability, was far more powerful than any spoken sentiment. And in that simple, quiet act of holding her, being present for her, I felt our bond deepen in a way that was both comforting and quietly exhilarating. Time seemed to stretch, elongating the moment. There was laughter, small and soft, when she tried to joke about her stress, and it felt natural, a release of tension we both needed. Fingers brushed almost accidentally, lingering just enough to remind us of the fragile warmth we were sharing. The house felt alive again, but differently, infused with intimacy, trust, and the subtle beginnings of a slow-burning emotional connection that neither of us had anticipated when the day began. And as I held her, steady and patient, I realized that this was no ordinary moment. It was a slow, quiet unfolding of trust and closeness, a delicate warmth that would linger far beyond the afternoon sunlight spilling across the floor. After what felt like an eternity in quiet connection, we finally separated slightly, enough to create a small space between us, though our hands still hovered close, almost touching. The warmth of her presence lingered like an unspoken promise, and I became suddenly aware of how my own heart was reacting, faster, heavier, and yet strangely tender. There was a pull I hadn't expected, a tension that wasn't physical in any overt sense, but emotional, subtle, and deeply human. As I looked at her, I noticed all the details I had often taken for granted before, the faint laugh lines around her eyes, the way her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, the careful way she carried herself even when tired or stressed. She seemed so grounded, yet the fragility of the afternoon had revealed a layer of vulnerability I hadn't seen before. It drew me in, but it also made me pause. Respect, admiration, and the weight of unspoken boundaries all collided in a single, complicated knot inside me. She glanced up at me then, and I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of awareness that our connection had shifted. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, but charged in a quiet, almost reverent way. The kind of charge that comes from mutual trust and human closeness, not desire expressed in the obvious sense. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, perhaps unconsciously, and I froze for a moment, aware of how potent a single gesture could feel. I thought about the age difference, about the roles we each held in our lives, and the natural hesitation that comes from knowing the lines that shouldn't be crossed. Yet I couldn't deny the magnetic pull of this moment, the way my chest tightened at her vulnerability, the gentle warmth that lingered when our fingers almost touched, the subtle rhythm of our breathing when we shared the same quiet space. It was a delicate tension, slow-burning and impossible to ignore, yet entirely restrained by mutual respect. She leaned back slightly, a soft smile brushing her lips, as if acknowledging that we were both aware of the unspoken complexities between us. It wasn't flirtation, not really, but something quieter, more profound, an emotional intimacy that teetered on the edge of something more but remained grounded in care and human connection. I could feel her hesitancy, the same self-awareness I felt myself, and it created a shared understanding that words would have ruined. In that quiet, suspended moment, I realized how powerful simple presence could be. I didn't need to say anything, and she didn't either. Every small gesture, the near touch of fingers, the lingering warmth when she leaned in, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders, spoke volumes about trust, mutual respect, and the slow-building bond between us. It was as if the world had contracted, leaving just the two of us in a bubble of shared awareness, each of us fully conscious of the subtle currents running between us. Finally, she gave a small, almost shy nod, and I responded with the same quiet acknowledgement. The tension remained, yes, but it was tempered by understanding, a recognition that connection doesn't always need to be defined or labeled. It could exist in the moment, in shared breaths, in lingering touches and mutual awareness, and that was enough. As I stepped back, creating a little more space, I felt the bittersweet ache of knowing how fragile this moment was. And yet, beneath the hesitation, there was warmth, hope, and the unmistakable sense that this connection, slow, careful, respectful, was only beginning. The room had settled into a calm quiet, the kind that follows a storm but carries its memory in the gentle hush of the air. Sunlight had shifted, casting long, soft shadows across the living room, painting everything in a golden warmth that seemed almost intentional, as if the house itself were giving us permission to breathe. She sat near the edge of the couch, a small distance from me, yet close enough that the warmth of her presence lingered between us. I could still feel it in my chest, the gentle imprint of her earlier embrace, the faint echo of her heartbeat against mine, even from a few feet away. She adjusted her cardigan lightly, a nervous, almost unconscious gesture, and I noticed how those small, human details made her even more present in my mind. The vulnerability had softened, replaced by a quiet composure, though the intimacy we had shared had left traces in the subtle lines of her expression and the gentle way her hands rested on her lap. There was a warmth there, not just physical, but emotional, a sense of trust that we had both cultivated, delicate and unspoken, that needed no words to exist. I sat down beside her, careful to leave enough space, yet close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed. The movement was quiet, considered, and in it, I felt the weight of shared understanding. She glanced at me briefly, eyes soft and reflective, and for the first time, I felt that unspoken acknowledgement of the bond we had formed. Not love in its traditional, overt sense, but something far more profound, the intimacy of trust, the quiet thrill of mutual vulnerability, the warmth of being allowed to exist fully alongside another person without pretense or judgment. We spoke then, softly, in fragments. She shared small, everyday thoughts, nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just enough to keep the conversation flowing and natural. I listened, responding with honesty and attentiveness, aware that in this space, even the simplest words carried weight. When she laughed quietly at a self-deprecating remark, the sound was like a gentle wind through the room, lifting the heaviness we had carried before. I realized then that moments like these, small, human, tender, were as powerful as any grand gesture could ever be. Our hands brushed almost accidentally, fingers grazing, and there was a fleeting pause as we both registered it. Not a moment of tension, but of recognition, a quiet signal that the bond we had shared through grief, vulnerability, and presence had left an imprint. I felt a protective warmth, not possessive, but deeply human, a desire to continue being there for her in this gentle, unwavering way. She sensed it too, a faint smile playing at her lips, eyes meeting mine with an acknowledgement that we had passed through something significant together. Time stretched and slowed, allowing us to linger in the quiet comfort we had built. There was no rush, no expectation, only the shared understanding that this connection, born of patience, presence, and empathy, was enough. The warmth of her presence, the subtle gestures, the gentle laughter, and the steady rhythm of conversation formed a tapestry of intimacy that was both safe and profound. When I finally rose to leave, she didn't move immediately. Our eyes met, and the unspoken words hung between us: gratitude, trust, and the quiet hope that this bond would endure, in whatever way life allowed. The house was calm, the light soft, and in that moment, everything felt complete. We had shared something rare, a human connection, slow-burning, respectful, and deeply satisfying, and I knew that its warmth would linger far beyond the walls of that room. If this moment touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow-burn stories that explore the beauty of human connection. Click the link in the description to watch the full story and experience every heartfelt moment.